My name is Linda Hale. I am 58 years old. For 13 years, my daughter Megan believed I had walked away from her, that I'd chosen my workshop over her, stopped paying my share once it became inconvenient, and let her father raise her alone while I built furniture in Worcester and never looked back. None of that was true. I have a folder of bank statements that proves it isn't true, but I never showed it to her because I didn't want her to spend her 20s choosing sides. Then, 3 months ago, Megan called me for the first time in almost 2 years to ask, carefully, almost apologetically, if I could help with her wedding venue deposit because her father's contribution had fallen through. I said yes before she'd even finished explaining. And that phone call is what finally cracked open 13 years of a story that was never true to begin with. Let me take you back to the beginning. Before I take you there, if stories like this one matter to you, please like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every one. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, the daughter of a cabinet maker named Joe Hale, who ran a small shop on Millbury Street for almost 40 years. I spent my childhood afternoons in that shop, smelling sawdust and shellac, learning to tell the grain of cherry from the grain of oak before I could properly tie my shoes. When my dad died in 2003, I took over the shop. I renamed it Hale Furniture. Small, 2 employees besides me, mostly custom dining tables, bedroom sets, the occasional church pew repair. I married Don Prout in 1991. We had Megan in 1994. For a long time, things were ordinary in the way most marriages are ordinary, fine on the surface, with smaller cracks underneath that neither of us wanted to look at too closely. Don worked in commercial insurance in an office in Framingham, about 40 minutes from Worcester. He was good with people, charming, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and told a story well at parties. I was good with wood and not particularly good at parties, and over the years, that difference became something Don brought up more and more, not cruelly, not at first, just little comments. "Linda's probably in the shop," he'd say, when people asked where I was, in a tone that made it sound like a punchline. I should say something about what those early years of marriage actually looked like, because I think it matters for understanding how the later story could happen at all. Don and I weren't unhappy in any dramatic way for most of Megan's childhood. We took her camping at Mount Monadnock every summer. Don taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot of his office building on weekends because it was flat and empty and he liked having a project. I taught her to use a hand plane when she was 9, standing on a step stool so she could reach the workbench, and she made a small wobbly box that I still have, tucked in a drawer in my office. The joints don't quite meet, and one side is slightly thicker than the others, but I never had the heart to throw it out. The cracks, when I look back honestly, were less about any single event and more about a slow divergence in what each of us thought a life should look like. Don wanted more, a bigger house, a more visible social life, vacations that photographed well. I wanted mostly to keep the shop running and to be home in time for dinner most nights, which wasn't always possible because custom furniture doesn't keep convenient hours. There were a few lean years, around 2007 and 2008, when the recession hit custom woodworking hard, and Don's frustration with our finances during those years left a residue that never fully went away, even after the shop recovered. We separated in 2010 when Megan was 16, and the divorce was finalized in 2012 when she was 18 and about to leave for college. I want to be honest about something. The divorce was not entirely Dawn's fault, and I'm not interested in pretending it was. But the story that got told about it, the story Megan grew up believing, was Dawn's story, told from Dawn's house, where Megan lived full-time starting at 16 because, as Dawn put it at the time, "It just makes more sense, Linda. You're at the shop until 7 most nights, and I have more flexibility." I agreed to that arrangement. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters for what comes later. I agreed to it because it seemed true. I was at the shop until 7 most nights, and Dawn's office let him leave at 4. At the time, it felt like the responsible choice, the choice that put Megan's stability first. I didn't realize, not for years, that responsible choice and the version of events Dawn would tell our daughter for the next 14 years were about to become the same thing. The divorce settlement required me to pay $450 a month in child support until Megan turned 18, which, given that she was already 16 and living primarily with Dawn, amounted to about 2 years of payments. I paid $640 a month instead every month for those 2 years, and then I kept paying it voluntarily with no court order requiring it. For 11 more years after that, through Megan's college years and into her mid-20s, because $640 a month was roughly what it cost to keep a young person afloat with rent, books, a car payment, and I knew Don's insurance salary, even with his new wife Patricia's income added in, wasn't going to stretch as far as Megan needed it to. I sent that money the same way every month for 13 years, a direct deposit into an account in Megan's name that Dawn had set up for her expenses. I have the bank records, 13 years of them, $640 a month, sometimes more around Christmas or before the start of a semester. $99,840 total, not counting the extra. Here is what I didn't know for a very long time. Megan believed that money didn't exist. She told me this herself, much later, almost as an aside, the way you mention something you've stopped being angry about because you've simply absorbed it as fact. She said, "Dad always said you stopped sending anything once the court order ran out. That you basically said, 'She's 18, she's not my responsibility anymore.'" I remember exactly where I was when she said that, standing in my kitchen, the phone against my ear, looking at the corkboard by my fridge where I still had a photo of Megan at 6 years old, missing both front teeth, holding up a birdhouse I'd helped her build. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That's not Megan, that's not what happened." And she said, gently, the way you'd correct someone you assumed was confused, "It's okay, Mom. I'm not asking you to explain it." It was a long time ago. I didn't push it further that day. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me had decided, years earlier, that correcting the record would just sound like an attack on her father, and that an 18-year-old and then a 20-year-old and a 25-year-old shouldn't have to hold both parents' versions of the truth at the same time, weighing them, picking sides. So I let it sit. For 13 years, I let it sit. The hardest part of those years wasn't the money. It was the milestones. Megan's high school graduation in 2012, the year the divorce finalized, I wasn't invited, not directly. Dawn told me when I called to ask about logistics that it might be easier for Megan if it's not, a whole thing with everyone there. She's stressed enough. I didn't go. I sat in my shop that evening after closing and I built a small cedar box, the kind you'd keep letters in, and I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. I just needed my hands to be doing something. Her college graduation, in 2016, I found out about after the fact, from a photo Meghan posted online, which I saw only because my friend Marjorie, who lived 2 houses down from me in Worcester and had known Meghan since she was a baby, showed it to me on her phone. I didn't have social media. I'd never made an account, mostly because in the early years after the divorce, looking at photos of Meghan's life without me in them felt like pressing on a bruise, and eventually not having an account just became how things were. Marjorie became, over those years, the person who kept a thread connecting me to Meghan's life, even when Meghan didn't know it. Marjorie was 71 when all this started, a retired postal carrier. The kind of woman who delivered mail on the same Worcester route for 32 years and therefore knew, in the specific way that mail carriers know things, who in the neighborhood was struggling and who wasn't, who'd had a baby, who'd lost a job, who needed a casserole on the porch without being asked. Marjorie had a niece who'd gone to the same college as Meghan, 2 years ahead of her, and through that thin thread, a niece, a mutual acquaintance, an old classmate's mother, Marjorie would occasionally come back with small updates. Meghan made the dean's list again. Meghan's living in Alston now, with 2 roommates. Meghan got a job at a marketing firm, starting in the fall. I lived on these updates the way you live on weather reports for a place you can't visit. For Meghan's college graduation, I wanted to send something, but I knew that anything from me directly would likely never make it past Don's house, or would arrive with a complicated explanation Meghan didn't ask for. So Marjorie had an idea. My aunt, my father's sister, Rose Hale, who had died in 2009, had been someone Meghan adored as a small child. Aunt Rose used to send Meghan birthday cards with a $5 bill folded inside every year until she died. Marjorie suggested, what if those cards kept coming, not from me, from Aunt Rose's estate, a small standing account Marjorie helped me set up, technically administered by Marjorie herself, that sent Meghan a card and a check on her birthday and at graduation signed simply, "Thinking of you, Aunt Rose's family." It wasn't really a lie, not exactly. Aunt Rose's family was me. But I let Meghan believe, for years, that some small trust from a great-aunt she barely remembered was quietly looking out for her, because I thought that was easier for her to receive than anything with my name on it. If you've ever loved someone from a distance they didn't know about quietly, without asking for anything back, type quiet in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one. In 2018, when Meghan was 24, I started building furniture for her. Not for any occasion. I just started. The first piece was a hope chest, cedar-lined, the kind my own grandmother had given my mother. I built it over about 6 weeks, evenings and weekends, using a piece of black walnut I'd been saving for years because the grain was unusually beautiful and I'd never found the right project for it. When it was finished, I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't very well drive it to Alston and leave it on Meghan's porch with a note. So I put it in a storage unit, a 10 by 15 unit on Route 9, $85 a month, and I told myself I'd give it to her when the time was right. Which is the kind of thing you tell yourself when you don't actually know if the time will ever come. Over the next 6 years, I built more. A pair of nightstands, also walnut, to match the hope chest. A dining table, 6-person, with 2 leaves that could extend it to 10, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I imagined Meghan someday hosting a holiday dinner, and I wanted there to be enough room at the table. A rocking chair, which I built in 2021 for reasons I didn't examine too closely at the time, and which I understood much later, looking back. I'd built around the time Marjorie mentioned that Megan had gotten engaged to a man named Jake. There were two pieces I haven't mentioned yet. One was a small jewelry box, cherry wood with a lid that opened on brass hinges I'd ordered specially from a supplier in Vermont. I built that one in 2019, the year Marjorie mentioned, almost in passing, that Megan had started dating someone. I didn't know his name yet. I just knew there was someone, and something about that small fact made me want to build something delicate. The other piece was a set of 4 dining chairs to go with the table. I'd built the table first, in 2020, and then realized a table with no chairs was an unfinished thought. So I spent most of 2022 on the chairs, one at a time, steam bending the back slats by hand because I didn't trust a jig to get the curve right for something I cared about this much. Every piece went into the unit wrapped carefully, moving blankets, corner protectors, the hope chest packed with cedar shavings to keep the air inside it fresh, the way you'd store something you fully expected, someday, to open again. I went out to the unit maybe 4 times a year, mostly just to check on humidity and make sure nothing had shifted. I never told anyone besides Marjorie that the unit existed. My employees at the shop knew I rented storage space for overflow inventory, which was technically true and also nothing close to the whole truth. By the time this story really starts, in the spring of this year, that storage unit held 6 pieces of furniture, $13,260 in cumulative rent over 13 years, and a daughter who didn't know any of it existed. I want to be fair to Megan in this story, the way I've tried to be fair to Dawn, because I don't think either of them is a villain, not really. Megan grew up in a house where one parent, her father, was present every day, told a consistent and sympathetic story, and remembered her birthday with a card that had his handwriting on it. The other parent, me, was an occasional voice on the phone, increasingly awkward as the years went on, calling on a schedule that started as weekly and slowly, without either of us quite deciding it, became monthly, and then became around the holidays, and then became something closer to twice a year. Megan wasn't cruel to me exactly. She was polite. Distant in the specific way that people are distant when they've made an unconscious decision that a relationship isn't worth the emotional cost of repairing, not angry enough to cut it off entirely, just quiet enough that it slowly starves on its own. Our calls were short. How's the shop? Good, busy. How's work? Good, busy. 2 minutes, sometimes 3, and then a natural feeling goodbye that left me sitting with the phone in my hand for a while afterward, in the quiet of my kitchen, looking at the photo on the corkboard. There was one Christmas, 2019 I think, or maybe 2020, the years blur a little, when Megan texted me a photo of herself in front of a small tree in her apartment, just a Merry Christmas, Mom, with no other context. I sat with that photo for a long time. She was 25 or 26 in it, wearing a sweater I didn't recognize, standing in a kitchen I'd never seen, in a life I knew almost nothing about. I wrote back, Merry Christmas, sweetheart, I love you. And then I sat at my own kitchen table alone, with the radio on, and I let myself cry for a while, which wasn't something I did often. Not because I was sad, exactly, more because the photo made the distance between us feel suddenly very physical, very measurable, like I could have pointed to a spot on a map and said, "That's how far away my daughter's Christmas is from mine." I went to therapy for a while in my early 50s, mostly about other things, my own father's death, the divorce, the shop's finances during a slow stretch in 2019. But Megan came up, eventually, the way she always did. My therapist asked me once, "Do you think Megan knows how much you've done for her?" And I remember saying, without much hesitation, "No." And I think that's okay. I don't need her to know. I just need her to be okay. I believed that when I said it. I think I mostly still believe it. But I don't need her to know, and "I've stopped hoping she'll find out" turned out to be two very different sentences, and I didn't notice the gap between them until the phone rang on a Tuesday evening in March. Megan called at 7:40 p.m. I remember the time because I was in the shop, finishing a coat of tung oil on a cabinet door, and I almost didn't pick up because my hands were covered in it. I saw her name on the screen. We hadn't talked since New Year's, almost 3 months, and I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice had a strange quality to it, careful in a way it usually wasn't. Do you have a minute?" I told her of course. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "So, this is okay. This is really awkward, and I want to say up front, you don't have to say yes, and if you say no, that's completely fine. She took a breath. "Jake and I put down a deposit on a venue for the wedding, back in January. And the plan was that Dad and Patricia were going to cover the rest of it. It's $9,500. And Dad just told me last week that they can't. Patricia's hours got cut at her job, and the deposit deadline is in 11 days. And if we don't pay it, we lose the venue and the date and basically have to start over. And I didn't know who else to ask." I want to describe what happened in me during the silence that followed, because I think it matters. There wasn't a flicker of resentment. There wasn't a "where was this concern for me 13 years ago" thought, even briefly. What I felt, instead, was something closer to relief. The specific relief of a door you'd assumed was permanently closed turning out to still have a working hinge. "Of course," I said. "I can send it tomorrow. What's the account information?" There was a pause on Megan's end, longer than I expected. "Just like that." "Just like that," I said. I sent the $9,500 the next morning, by bank transfer, to the account Megan gave me. I didn't attach a note, mostly because I genuinely couldn't think of one that didn't sound either too small or too much. Megan texted that afternoon, "Thank you so much. Seriously, I don't even know what to say." I texted back, "You don't have to say anything. I'm glad I could help. Good luck with the planning. I hope it's everything you want." I assumed that would be the end of it, a transaction, a kindness, a small bridge crossed and then left behind, the way most of our interactions had been for years. But about a week later, Megan texted again, out of nowhere, on a Thursday afternoon. "Random question, are you around this weekend? I'm coming through Worcester to look at flowers with a florist near you, and I thought maybe we could grab coffee after. No big deal if not." I said yes. Of course I said yes. We met at a coffee shop on Park Avenue, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. Megan arrived a few minutes late, a little flushed from the cold, and hugged me briefly, but a real hug, the first one in longer than I could remember. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about anything enormous, the wedding planning, Jake's job, a funny story about the florist trying to upsell her on eucalyptus. But there was something different in how she was talking to me. She kept looking at me a little longer than usual, like she was re-noticing something. Near the end, almost as we were getting up to leave, Megan said, "Can I ask you something? And I don't want it to be weird." "Of course." "After the divorce, did you and Dad, did you guys split things evenly? Financially, with me? I don't really know the details. I was a kid, and I never really asked." I felt my chest tighten. I thought about the folder. I thought about the storage unit. I thought about 13 years of deciding, over and over, that this wasn't my story to correct. There's a lot to that question, I said carefully. More than I can really get into standing here putting our coats on. Do you want to come by the shop sometime? I could show you some things. It might explain it better than I can in words. Megan looked at me for a moment, and something in her face shifted curiosity, maybe a little wariness. Okay, she said. Yeah, I'd like that. She came to the shop the following Saturday. I'd been awake since 5 that morning, not because there was anything urgent to do, but because I couldn't sleep. I kept rearranging things in the front room, moving a chair, moving it back, wiping down a workbench that was already clean. Megan arrived a little after 10, and I gave her the tour I'd given 100 people before: the bandsaw, the planer, the wall of clamps, the smell of sawdust that she used to know so well as a kid and that I could see, watching her face, she hadn't smelled in years. She ran her hand along a half-finished tabletop and said, "I forgot how much I liked this smell." Then I took her to the back room, where I kept the storage unit's spare key in a drawer, and I told her there was something I wanted to show her, but it wasn't here, it was a short drive away. She looked confused, but she came. The storage unit was exactly as I'd left it a few months earlier, when I'd added the rocking chair. I rolled up the door, and the overhead light flickered on, and Megan stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. The hope chest, the nightstands, the dining table disassembled and wrapped in moving blankets, its 2 leaves leaning against the wall beside it. The rocking chair. "What is all this?" Megan asked. Her voice was quiet. "This is yours," I said. "All of it. I've been building it for you since you were 24. The hope chest is the oldest one, that's black walnut. I'd been saving that wood since before you were even born. Actually, your grandfather gave me that board. The nightstands match it. The table," I touched the edge of it under the moving blanket. "The table seats 10 with both leaves in. I built it because I used to imagine you hosting Thanksgiving someday, and I wanted there to be enough room." Megan didn't say anything for a long time. She walked over to the rocking chair and sat down in it, slowly, the way you'd sit in something you were afraid might not hold your weight, even though I'd built it to hold considerably more. She ran her hands along the armrests. "I built that one a few years ago," I said, "around the time I heard you'd gotten engaged." "How did you hear that?" Megan asked. "I don't think I ever told you. I told Dad and—" She stopped. Something was working behind her eyes. "Marjorie," I said, "down the street from me. Her niece went to school with you. She's how I knew most things over the years." Here's something I think is worth pausing on. Only about 3% of people who watch videos like this one ever actually subscribe. If this story is speaking to you, take a second and tap that button. It helps this channel keep telling stories like Linda's. Okay, let's keep going. We drove back to the shop in near silence. Megan sat with her hands in her lap, looking out the window, and I could tell something was turning over in her. When we got back, she said, "Can I ask you something else? And I need you to just answer honestly, even if it's not nice." "Okay." "Dad always said that after I turned 18, you stopped, that the support just ended. That you basically said it wasn't your responsibility anymore. Is that true?" I had thought about this moment for years, in the abstract, what I would say if it ever came. I'd imagined versions where I was angry, versions where I cried, versions where I just said, "Ask your father," and left it at that. What actually happened was much quieter than any of those. "No," I said. "That's not true. I have the records if you want to see them. I sent $640 a month for 13 years, through high school, through college, and for several years after. That's about $100,000, not counting extra for things like your laptop in college or the security deposit on your first apartment, which I sent to your dad's account because that's the account I had." Megan's face had gone very still. $100,000. "Give or take, I can show you the statements. I kept all of them." "Why didn't you?" Megan started again. "Why didn't you ever say anything for 13 years? I thought about how to answer that honestly, because I'd asked myself the same question more times than I could count. "Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to pick a side," I said. "Your dad told you a story about the divorce and about me, and I think some of it, not all of it, but some of it probably felt true to him, too. He was the one who was there every day. I wasn't. And I think correcting that story, when you were 18 or 20 or 25, would have meant asking you to be angry at the parent you saw every day, on behalf of the parent you barely saw at all. That seemed like a worse trade than just letting it sit." Megan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very softly, "I think I need to go home and think about some things." I told her that was okay. I meant it. I didn't hear from Megan for 4 days, and I want to be honest, those were a hard 4 days. I kept thinking I'd overcorrected, that showing her the storage unit and the bank records had been a mistake, that I'd handed my 29-year-old daughter a grenade 3 months before her wedding and then sent her home to deal with the aftermath alone. On the 5th day, Megan called. Her voice sounded different, tired, but not closed off, the way it had sometimes sounded over the years. "I talked to Dad," she said. "I showed him the bank statement you gave me copies of just 1 month from 2015. I asked him about it." "How did that go?" "Not great at first," Megan said. "He got defensive, said it was complicated, said there were other arrangements he'd made with that money, said I didn't understand the full financial picture from back then. But I kept asking. Just what happened to this $640 specifically in March of 2015? And he didn't have an answer. He just kept saying it was complicated. I didn't say anything. I'd promised myself, going into this, that I wouldn't push, wouldn't pile on, wouldn't turn Megan's reckoning with her father into something I steered. I don't want this to become like a whole war between you and Dad with me in the middle," Megan said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to blow up my relationship with him 3 months before my wedding, but I also can't just unknow this. I spent 13 years thinking you didn't show up. And the truth is you showed up more than I ever knew, and I never said thank you because I didn't know there was anything to say thank you for." Megan told me a little more about the conversation with Don later that week over the phone. She said he'd been sitting at his kitchen table when she brought it up, going through mail, and that he hadn't looked up right away. When she put the bank statement in front of him, March 2015, $640 deposited into the account he'd set up. He'd gone quiet for what she described as a really long time for him, because Don was not, by nature, a quiet man. He said something like, "There were a lot of expenses back then that your mom didn't really understand, insurance, my own costs, things that came up." And I asked him, point blank, "Did this $640 go toward my expenses or toward yours?" And he didn't answer that. He just said it was a long time ago and water under the bridge and asked if we could talk about something else. I told Megan I appreciated her telling me, but that I didn't need a verdict, and I meant that. I wasn't trying to win anything from Dawn. All these years later, what would there even be to win? But I think Megan needed to ask the question out loud, to him, in a way that didn't let him simply restate the old story and have it accepted the way it always had been. That, more than any amount of money, seemed to be the thing that mattered to her. A few days after that conversation, Don called me directly, which he hadn't done in years, outside of logistics about Megan's graduations, or, before that, brief check-ins when she was still in college. His voice was careful, a little stiff, the way people sound when they've rehearsed something and are still not sure they want to say it. Megan showed me some statements, he said. I wanted to say, I think I maybe didn't give you enough credit over the years for what you were sending. I had a lot going on back then, with Patricia, with the move, and I think I just stopped tracking it mentally after a certain point. I'm not saying I told Megan things that weren't true on purpose. I think I just stopped correcting myself once a certain version of things became easier. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. There was a lot of passive construction in it, a lot of I think I and maybe. The careful hedging of a man who wanted credit for self-reflection without quite admitting fault. But it was more than I'd expected, and I told him so. I said, I appreciate you saying that. I'm not interested in relitigating 13 years, Dawn. I just didn't want Megan walking into her wedding thinking I'd abandoned her, when that's not what happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, No, I don't think she thinks that anymore. And that was the end of the call, not warm exactly, but not cold either. Just two people, a long time after the worst of it, finding a flat and level place to stand. You don't have to say thank you, I said. I didn't do any of it for that. I know, Megan said. That's actually what makes it worse, kind of. If you'd wanted credit, I'd at least understand it. But you just did it, for 13 years. And I was right there, thinking you disappeared. I want to tell you about Marjorie, because I think she's the reason any of this was even possible. And because what she did for me cost her something I didn't fully understand until recently. Marjorie turned 81 this year. About 4 years ago, her son, her only child, a man named Phil who lives in Connecticut, had a falling out with her over their late father's estate, the details of which Marjorie has never fully explained to me, except to say it involved a piece of land in Vermont and some things Phil's wife said that I haven't been able to get past yet. Marjorie and Phil haven't spoken in almost 3 years. I didn't know any of this when Marjorie first offered to help me with the Aunt Rose cards back in 2016. I assumed she was just being Marjorie, the kind of person who shows up with a casserole. But a few months ago, not long after Megan and I started talking again, Marjorie and I were having tea on her porch, and she said, almost in passing, You know, helping you keep that thread to Megan. It gave me something to do with all the love I had nowhere to put after Phil and I stopped talking. I used to think about that a lot, that I was helping you stay connected to your daughter while I couldn't figure out how to stay connected to my son. I asked her if she'd ever thought about reaching out to Phil the way she'd helped me reach toward Megan, quietly, without demanding anything, just leaving a door open. She was quiet for a while, then she said, I think I've been telling myself it's different, that what happened with Phil is more final somehow, but maybe it isn't. Maybe I just got more practice helping someone else's door stay open than I gave myself credit for with my own. I don't know what's going to happen with Marjorie and Phil. But about 3 weeks ago, I saw her sitting on her porch with a notepad, and when I asked what she was working on, she smiled a little and said, "Just a card. For Phil's birthday. We'll see." The week after Megan called Dawn about the bank statement, something happened that I didn't expect, and that I'm still turning over in my mind. Megan asked if she could bring Jake to meet me, properly, not just a wave at the coffee shop, but dinner at my house, the kind of evening where you cook too much food because you're nervous. I hadn't had Megan in my house in 11 years. Not since before the divorce was even finalized, really. There'd been a brief period right after we separated when she'd stay over some weekends, but that had tapered off quickly once she moved into Dawn's house full-time, and by the time she left for college, Mom's house wasn't really a place she thought of as hers anymore. I spent 2 days cleaning a house that didn't need cleaning. I made a pot roast, because it was the thing Megan used to ask for on her birthday when she was small, and I wasn't sure if she'd even remember that, or if it would just seem like an odd, old-fashioned thing for a 58-year-old woman to make for a 32-year-old's first dinner back in 11 years. Jake turned out to be quiet and a little formal in the way people are when they're meeting a parent for the first time and don't fully know the history. He's an electrician, originally from Springfield, and at one point during dinner he asked, very politely, "So did you build the table we're sitting at?" Not knowing, I think, quite how loaded that question was, given everything that had happened in the preceding weeks. Megan and I looked at each other for a second, and then Megan said, "No, that one's older. That was actually my grandfather's. But Mom built one that's..." And she paused like she was deciding how much to say. "Bigger, for 10 people. It's in storage right now." 10 people, Jake said. That's a lot of chairs. "I'm working on the chairs," I said, and Megan laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And for a moment the whole evening felt almost ordinary, the way I imagine it might have felt if none of the last 13 years had happened the way they happened. Megan's wedding is in 6 weeks. I'm going, Megan asked me herself, on the phone, not through a logistics email the way the invitations to her graduations had been handled. She asked if I would help with one more thing. She wants the dining table, the 10-person one, from the storage unit, set up at the reception, as the head table. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said, "moving a table that big, but I want people to ask about it, and I want to be the one who tells them." I told her I'd take care of moving it. I didn't tell her that I cried a little after we hung up, not from sadness, exactly. Something more like the feeling of setting down something heavy you'd carried for so long you'd forgotten it'd weight. Don and I have spoken a couple of times since that phone call, both times briefly, both times a little stiff, but not unkind. He hasn't apologized in any larger or more formal way, though Megan tells me he's been different lately, quieter, less quick with the easy stories he used to tell about the divorce, more careful, she says, about not mentioning me at all rather than mentioning me the old way. I don't know if that's guilt or just the discomfort of a familiar story losing its audience. I'm not holding my breath for anything more than what's already happened, and I've made peace with that. I didn't do any of this, the payments, the furniture, the 13 years, to win an argument with Dawn. I did it because Megan was my daughter, and I loved her, even from a distance she didn't know about. One thing Don did do, which surprised me, was call the venue himself and ask if there was any way to split the remaining balance. He and Patricia ended up covering the catering deposit, about $2,200, on their own, without being asked. Megan told me about it almost shyly, like she wasn't sure how I'd take the news that her father had stepped up for part of it after all. I told her honestly that I was glad. This was never about which parent paid for what. It was about Megan knowing, finally, what had actually happened. And once she knew, it seems like everyone involved, including Dawn, found a little more room to be the people they'd probably wanted to be all along. Megan and I talk every week now. Not long calls, not always easy ones. There's 13 years of distance that doesn't close in 3 months, and I'm not pretending it does. But last Sunday, she called just to ask my opinion on a centerpiece. Just that. A small, ordinary question, the kind of question a daughter asks a mother. It's the kind of call I used to imagine back when I was building that hope chest in 2018, not knowing if the time would ever come. There was one moment, about a month ago, that I think about more than almost anything else from this whole stretch of time. Megan came by the shop on a weekday afternoon, unannounced, which she'd never done before. I was in the middle of sanding a tabletop, and she stood in the doorway for a minute before I noticed her, just watching, the way I used to watch my own father work when I was small. "I found something," she said, and held up her phone. It was a photo, old, scanned, a little crooked of me at maybe 26, pregnant, standing in front of the shop with my father, both of us laughing at something out of frame. Dad had a box of old photos in the garage. I was looking for my passport and I found this. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of you and Grandpa Joe together. I didn't really know you worked with him. "I worked with him for almost 15 years, I said. "He taught me everything. The hope chest I built you, that's his wood. He'd been saving that board since before you were born." Megan looked at the photo again, and then around the shop at the bandsaw, the wall of clamps, the half-finished pieces waiting for their next coat. "I think I always knew this place existed," she said slowly, "but I never really thought about it as like a whole life, your whole life. I just thought of it as the shop, like it was a place you went, not a place you were from." I didn't have a quick answer for that. I just told her she was welcome here anytime, that the door was never locked during the day, and she didn't need to call first. She said okay, and then she stayed for another hour, just sitting on a stool near the workbench while I sanded, occasionally asking what a tool was called, occasionally not saying anything at all. It was, I think, the most relaxed I'd seen her be around me since she was a teenager, and neither of us made a big thing of it, which I think is part of why it mattered. I've thought about this a lot since it all happened, and a few things stand out to me now that didn't back then. The first thing is about silence. For 13 years, I told myself that staying quiet about the money, about the furniture, about everything, was an act of love, a way of protecting Megan from having to choose between her parents. And in some ways, I think it was. But I also think silence can become its own kind of absence, even when you're doing everything else right. Megan didn't need me to win an argument with her father. But she did need to know the truth was there, eventually, even if it took years to arrive. The second thing is about the difference between giving and being known for giving. I used to think those were almost the same, that giving quietly was a purer form of love, somehow, than giving visibly. I don't think that's quite right anymore. Megan didn't need me to announce what I was doing. But not knowing it had happened at all meant she spent 13 years building a version of her childhood that simply wasn't true, and that cost her something too, not just me. The third thing is about Don. I don't think Don is a monster, and I've tried not to tell this story like he is one. I think Don told a story that was easier for him to live with, and probably, in some way, easier for 8-year-old Megan to live with too, at the time. but easier stories have a way of calcifying. By the time Megan was old enough to ask harder questions, the easy story had been repeated so many times it had started to feel like just the facts. The fourth thing is about Marjorie and about the people who quietly carry pieces of our lives that we've set down. I don't think I ever properly thanked her, not in 13 years, for the cards, the updates, the thread she kept alive when I didn't have the strength to hold it myself. I'm trying to do better with that now, not just with Marjorie, but in general. I think a lot of us have a Marjorie. I think most of us don't say thank you nearly enough. And the fifth thing, the one I keep coming back to, especially now, with the wedding 6 weeks away and the chairs still not quite finished, and a centerpiece I've promised to help glue together next weekend, is that it's not too late. 13 years is a long time. It's long enough that I genuinely stopped believing the door would ever open again, even though I never quite closed it myself. But it opened. Not because of some grand gesture, and not because of an argument I won. It opened because of a phone call about a venue deposit, and a folder of bank statements I'd kept for 13 years without knowing why. Except that some part of me must have known, all along, that someday they might matter. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear from you. Tell me about something you've quietly carried for someone, money, time, a piece of the truth that they didn't know about. Did they ever find out? I read every comment and I'd love to know. I'll be at that wedding in 6 weeks, sitting at a table I built with my own hands, with chairs I'm still finishing in the evenings after the shop closes. Megan asked if I'd say a few words at the reception, not a long speech, just something short. I haven't written it yet. I think, when I do, it won't be about any of this, the money, the records, the years of silence. I think it'll just be about how proud I am of the woman she's become, and how glad I am to be there to see it. Everything else, I think, can stay quietly where it belongs, in a folder, in a storage unit, in the kind of love that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Thanks so much for watching and for sitting with Linda's story today. I'll see you in the next one.